and share. Right, so does everybody see this? Splendid. Okay, right. So welcome everybody. I'll give you a little quick rundown about Life on the Edge. I'm sure some of you will already know a fair bit about it, and some of you may know a little bit less. So we'll try and give it a brief rundown. The project is run by South Devon National Landscape in partnership with Bug Life and is funded by the National Lottery Heritage Fund. It's a big project comprising many different partners. There are delivery partners such as the Torbay Coast and Countryside Trust, National Trust, the Southwest Coast Path Association, and Doorstep Arts. We're funded by the National Lottery Heritage Fund, Devon Environment Foundation, and Milky Wire. And we have numerous supporting partners, as are all written here on this slide. And just to save you some time, I shan't go through the lot of them. So here is the Life on the Edge project area. In purple, you can see the borders of the South Devon National Landscape. And the Life on the Edge project area spans from Wembury in the west to Berryhead in the east. It covers the total B line, which is marked in yellow. The B line extends 3 kilometers from the coast inland, and it has a total area of 12,260 hectares. And then we have certain project hotspots, which are chosen for their particular value for invertebrate biodiversity. These ones are the ones highlighted in orange on the map. There's Wembury to the west, and then heading eastward, the next along is the and then Bolt-tailed Bolt Head, and then Trawl Point Start Point, and then Brownstone to Berryhead. So Life on the Edge is all about protecting invertebrates, particularly 30 target species. Here's a small selection of the target species. We've got various different kinds of bees and wasps. We've got moths, butterflies, oil beetles, bush crickets, as well as some flies and even one spider. But it's a very, very long and comprehensive list. And Life on the Edge is not just about the protection of invertebrates, but also about their habitat. This habitat in particular, which is species-rich grassland, particularly coastal species-rich grassland. The reason that we're targeting improving this habitat is because agricultural intensification since the Second World War has slowly sort of meant that further inland, there's less and less suitable habitat, and many invertebrate species are becoming trapped by coastal squeeze in a small patch of wildflower-rich habitat along the coast. So we hope to try and restore as much of this coastal wildflower-rich habitat as possible, thereby boosting the populations of some of Britain's most rare and threatened invertebrates. So, quick rundown of what we've been up to so far this year and what we have planned. We have 50.5 hectares of scrub management planned, which is just punching holes in big chunks of scrub, allowing for more diversity and a more sort of habitat mosaic of wildflower-rich grassland and scrub, rather than areas being completely scrub dominated. Then we've done 12.34 hectares of arable reversion, which is taking cropland and moving it back into grassland. Then we've created 5.52 hectares of seed donor site, which is it's there for the long-term goals of Life on the Edge. We want to produce 100 hectares of seed donor site over the course of the project. These 100 hectares will provide seed from a wide plethora of wildflower species, which can then be used to proliferate this habitat in the future. So on top of the seed donor site creation, we've restored and improved 14.6 hectares of relatively species poor grassland into a more species rich state. And over the course of this winter, we have 5 bee banks and clifflets planned along the coast, which will provide additional nesting habitat for particularly mining bees, but other rare and threatened invertebrates as well. So on top of all of our work for habitat, we've also been doing a lot of community engagement work. There's a total of 208 planned events across various different things in engaging with different groups of people. And over the course of the events we've done so far this year, we've engaged with 2,200 members of the public, and we've had 214 attendees to our Meet the Species events out on the coast. So last part I want to briefly give a rundown on is the volunteering and grant scheme of Life on the Edge. So we've got 2 grants available, a community grant of up to £2,000, which helps communities to engage in Life on the Edge, which can be, for example, this picture in the bottom left here is Stoke Gabriel Rocket Meadows project, where the community got together and gave out sachets of seeds funded by Life on the Edge, which each sachet would cover a 1 meter squared area, and that could therefore provide a large sort of spread out area of wildflower and nectar resources throughout the village of Stoke Gabriel. And they were able to give out 300 packets, so that's 300 meters squared of flowers that are now scattered around the village. We can also do a £5,000 grant for landowners who would like to do to work towards Life on the Edge's goals, which is the picture in the top left here, where we helped a landowner plant a seed mix over 0.8 of a hectare, with the seed mix targeted to have the maximum available amount of food plants for longhorn bee. Then last of all, we've got a little bit of volunteering that has happened so far this year, but particularly moving into next year, we'll have a lot more volunteering tasks available. There's practical conservation tasks, and then there will be more sort of species orientated tasks, such as surveying and training of ID skills. And that sort of neatly brings us on to what John's going to be talking about today. And John's going to be able to fill us in all on British oil beetles, how to identify them and where we might find them. So I will end this up here and pass you over to John.
Okay, right. See if I can find. Here we go. Share. Can you see that? Is that okay?
Yep.
Brilliant.
Yep.
Okay, well, thanks, Sam. And thanks, everyone, for tuning in this evening to listen to this talk on British oil beetles. During the talk, I'll give you a brief introduction to myself and how I got into oil beetles, and then show you how to identify the various different species. So I've been interested in natural history ever since I was tiny. I'm 60 now, and I started when I was 3. So I've got a wide interest in natural history, birds, horrid ground weaver, spiders, frogs, and oil beetles and bees. So that's what we'll be talking about this evening. I remember very vividly seeing my first oil beetle. It was at Kynance Cove when I was at college down in Falmouth. And we went out to Kynance Cove, and I found this beetle crawling along the path, and then picked it up, and it sort of shriveled up its legs, and then this sort of strange oil came out of its knee joints. Very weird looking thing. I went back home and looked it up and read a little bit about it. But I didn't realize at that point that I'd spent so much of my time in recent years anyway, studying these amazing beetles. So they're called oil beetles because, as I said, if they're disturbed, they produce a toxic oil from their knee joints. In America, these beetles are called blister beetles. and because I presume they cause blisters on skin. But I've picked up lots of these, and the ones in the UK anyway don't seem to cause a problem like that. But if you have sensitive skin, then maybe best avoid picking them up. This chemical is that they produce is quite toxic, and it's easily seen when I've been studying some violet oil beetles I'll talk about in a little while. And in one of the sites I study them, there's lots of wood ants. And wood ants will just attack any beetles usually, but if they find an oil beetle, they'll start attacking it, and then after a few minutes they give up. They just don't like the taste of this toxic chemical that the oil beetle exudes, not just from its knee joints, but from its body in general. Some insects, though, are drawn to oil beetles because of this toxic chemical cantharidin. And some of these are little tiny midges, and these seek out oil beetles and suck up the oils from them. And I think they use them to enhance their own chemical defenses. This was one in particular that got particularly covered in these tiny midges. That was up in the Dark Valley, violet oil beetle in the Dark Valley on Dartmoor. And also these cardinal beetles, if they find an oil beetle, they will jump on board and suck up some of these chemicals, and they use this to reinforce their own chemical defense. In some species on the continent, the males have to find some of this cantharidin from an oil beetle and then pass this to the female before they can mate. But I don't think this occurs in the UK because the oil beetles are too scarce, really. The cardinal beetles are much more widespread and certainly occur in areas where you don't find oil beetles. There are some similar species which can be mistaken for oil beetles, and here's some of them. The bloody nose beetle, a leaf beetle called Galaruca, a violet ground beetle, and the devil's coach horse. All of these beetles can be distinguished from oil beetles because they have on their wing cases the elytra at the back of the body. They have a straight line down the middle of them. On all oil beetles, they have short wing cases and they do overlap slightly. Also, oil beetles, as you'll see during the course of the presentation, are quite elongate, so maybe a little bit more like the devil's coach horse, but not as long and skinny as the devil's coach horse. And maybe some of the females particularly have quite big bloated bodies, so similar to the Galaruca leaf beetle. But once you have a close look at them, you can see these beetles are quite distinct. The violet ground beetle I put in there because that is something that does get mistaken because of its violet colour, and it's a similar size to the oil beetles, but it is a completely different insect when you look at it closely. So these are the British oil beetles. So we have 5 British species which are known and 3 others which are thought to be extinct. So the species we have are the black oil beetle, the violet oil beetle, which are active in the spring and day active. Then we have the rugged oil beetle and the Mediterranean oil beetle, which are winter active and nocturnal, and the short-necked oil beetle, which is a day active spring species. In the past, there were other species which occurred probably about 100 years ago now. So the variegated oil beetle, Loe variegatus, autumnal oil beetle, which I think, as its name suggests, is more likely to be seen in the autumn, and the scarred oil beetle. But they haven't been seen for about 100 years, so they're almost certainly extinct, but not necessarily so. The short-necked oil beetle was thought to be extinct, and then it was rediscovered in about 20 years ago now. And it was thought to be long extinct. So some of these other species may be around if we're trying to get more awareness really on identification of oil beetles and more people out there looking for them, and maybe some of these other species will be rediscovered. There are other species of oil beetles, not in the genus Meloe, which are the ones we're mainly looking at this evening. And there are a few others which have a similar life cycle. So this is one called Sitaris, the flame-shouldered oil beetle. And this one is a cuckoo inside the nests of hairy-footed flower bees. And it was thought to be extinct, but then it was rediscovered fairly recently in the last sort of 20 years. Paul Brock just found them in Brockenhurst, and it's been found at Wareham and also near Salisbury. It's quite unusual because the beetles actually are active in August and the bees are active in the early spring, so a completely different time of year. So to look for this species, you've really got to go to sites where you find hairy-footed flower bees nesting and look at these in August and see if you can find some of these oil beetles there. This is one such site. This is a site near Salisbury where the hairy-footed flower bees nest in a cob wall, and I went there in August and found that flame-shouldered oil beetle. That was it, just sitting by the entrance. So these oil beetles don't do very much. They emerge from the bee nest, and I'll talk a bit more about the life history later on. And they mate on the outside of the bee burrow. The female lays her eggs and then they die, so they don't really go far. And then, as well as that, there's three other species which are, two others which are fairly closely related, and one which has a similar life history. So Litter vesicatoria, the Spanish fly, is mainly a southern European species, but it does occasionally get seen in southern England. It's been known from the Isle of Wight, and there was one seen in Dorset a couple of years ago, but it is a very rare species in the UK. The ivy bee blister beetle, which is, as its name suggests, is associated with ivy bees, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that at the very end of the talk. And the wasp nest beetle, which is not in the genus Meloidae, or not in the family Meloidae, but it has a very similar life history. So it lays eggs on bits of wood that wasps will come along the following year. So the beetles lay eggs on bits of bare wood. The wasps come along and collect that wood and then get the little larvae of this wasp onto them and then take them back to the wasp nest, and then the wasp nest beetle larva develops inside the wasp nest. So these things have got quite complex life histories, as I'll explain. I really started working on these, it was about 20 years ago now, on a project funded by Bug Life, Natural England, Oxford Museum of Natural History and the National Trust. So I've been interested for quite a few years, in looking at oil beetles. I find them around where I live on the edge of Dartmoor, but I haven't really studied them in depth. So this gave me a real opportunity to sit and actually study them, find out a bit more about them. At that time, there's very little information. There's a guide in British Wildlife magazine from 2002, which was a guide to all the known oil beetles at that time. There were 4 species of Malawi black oil beetles with extant populations at that time. So that's volume 14, number 1, on page 27 to 30, if you want to order a back copy of that. And during the course, one of the first things I did during the project was produce a guide to the oil beetles. So this was for Bug Life, and I think it's still available from Bug Life, and it's certainly, I've got a copy of it on my website, so if you'd like to have a look at that, I can give you the details later on. So this is a sort of guide that I would have liked when I started looking at oil beetles. So it gives you those confusion species and then takes you through the salient points of identification of the 5 British species which are known to occur.
Sorry to interrupt you, John.
Sorry?
Sorry, I was just going to say, I've for everyone that's attending on Friday, I've printed out copies of that to bring along for everybody.
Okay, great. Thanks, Sam. And also managed to pick up a very good book. It's a German book on oil, all about oil beetles. It's very, very comprehensive. It's all in German, but it's got lots of photographs in there. And I've had bits of it translated. Our eldest son lives in Austria, so he can speak German, and he translates little bits for me every now and again. So that's a really brilliant book. I'm not sure if it's even in print anymore, but it's a fabulous book all about European oil beetles. So the first oil beetle we'll be looking at is the black oil beetle, Meloe proscarabaeus. This one is a spring emerging species, as I mentioned earlier, and it's one of the commonest. So there's 2 reasonably common species of oil beetle, the black and the violet oil beetle. Unfortunately, they're the 2 which are probably the most tricky to identify. But you can see immediately from those confusion species I showed you earlier, if you look at the wing cases, they overlap on an oil beetle. It has generally quite a small thorax and a slightly larger head. and it's quite a gangling sort of lumbering thing. It's not a particularly fast active insect. It sort of lumbers around on the ground, and it's sort of immune to the predations of birds and things because it has these chemicals inside its body. So it walks around quite brazenly out in the open. So they are, when you finding oil beetles is relatively easy in species like this, just going out in the daytime in the spring to look for them. This species starts to emerge in about the middle of February and is active through February, sort of March, mainly active March, April, and into May. And it has an annual life cycle, so the females will lay their eggs in the spring and they will emerge in the same year. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. As I said, it's a bit unfortunate that the two commonest species are the most similar of our 5 known species of oil beetle. And the key features in the black oil beetles is because colour actually isn't that helpful, and the names don't really help that much because the black oil beetle, as you can see, it can be quite a sort of shiny, sort of metallic blue, sort of iridescent blue colour. But and it also can be all black. The violet oil beetle is not necessarily violet blue, it can be all black as well. So there's a lot of variation in colour. So colour isn't enormously helpful. But generally, as a rule, black oil beetles are sort of like a funereal black colour with cobalt blue legs. And that is a good feature. They're a little bit more robust as insects compared to violet oil beetles. And they have quite dense, sort of heavy pitting on their thorax and head. Whereas the violet oil beetle has much finer pitting there, but it's all sort of subtle features. The main thing to look at on these beetles is the thorax. And in fact, if you just gave me the thorax of any, a dead oil beetle, I could identify the species just from having a thorax. So that's when you're taking photographs of these species, these beetles, if you're out in the field, really concentrating on getting a close-up view from above of the thorax, and that will enable you to identify all the species. So in the black oil beetle, the thorax, as I said, is quite densely pitted. It has a almost straight lower edge, and between the thorax and the wing cases, there's a little area called the mesonotum. And on the black oil beetle, this has a very small tooth in the middle of it, as I've indicated there. And on the violet oil beetle, that tooth is much more enlarged. And that's the best way to tell them apart. They vary a lot in size. These are kleptoparasites in solitary bee nests. So there will be a lot of variation in size depending on how much food the larvae of these oil beetles found inside the nest. So the one on the left obviously didn't find much, and it's a sort of small runt individual. But the one on the right is a much more typical size, and they're sort of 2 to 3 centimeters long. So this is the distribution of the black oil beetle. So mainly in the southwest, mainly coastal, but it does occur inland, particularly on downland. So its main habitats are coastal grasslands, such as the areas around that Sam was talking about in South Devon. Coastal grasslands, this is at Sandy Bay near Exmouth, which is a very good site for the oil beetles. And these are areas where there's a flower-rich grassland, there's a lot of solitary bees, and this is what the oil beetles use as hosts. This is an inland site. So this is at Cernabas Giant at the Viewpoint in Dorset. And in the spring, if you want to see black oil beetles, if you're there, they're very common on that small area just beside those little wooden posts. Usually in April time. If you go there in April, you will see them. Sort of March, April time, you'll find the black oil beetles there. And the second of the commoner species is the violet oil beetle. And as I said, the key features on this are the punctures on its head and thorax are much finer as a rule, and also the thorax is slightly stepped down at the base and it's slightly indented, but that's quite a minor feature. It's more this stepped down base of the thorax. But the key feature is the mesonotum between the thorax and the wing cases. It has quite a big tooth, much more noticeable tooth in the middle of it, which tells it immediately from the black oil beetle. So when I'm looking at these oil beetles, they have got a sort of jizz to them. This one's not quite so robustly built. So the black oil beetle is a much sort of tougher looking thing. And these are generally finer and a little bit slimmer, but that's quite a subtle difference. So when I'm looking at them or looking at photographs which have been sent to me, I check the thorax, see if it has an indented step at the base of it. And then if I can see that tooth there, I check for that as well. But you do need to get quite close up photographs to see those features. As I said, violet oil beetles can be all black. There's an all black violet oil beetle, but if you look at the thorax, you can see it's indented at the base, and also it has that stepped down appearance, and you can just make out there the larger tooth between that and the wing cases. Now, the violet oil beetle has a wider distribution, and it occurs again southwest England. Southwest England, Devon in particular, is a very good place for oil beetles. This one occurs right through up into Scotland as well. It prefers sort of more humid habitats, and it also has a different life history. So it has a 2-year life history, the violet oil beetle, whereas the black oil beetle females will emerge in the spring, lay their eggs, and those eggs will hatch into larvae within a few weeks. The violet oil beetles emerge in the spring, the adult beetles. They will lay their eggs usually in May, and then those eggs won't emerge until the following spring. So there's 2 almost separate generations of beetles around, and this is the only species that you can find the triangle in larvae, which I'll talk about in a minute, and the adults at the same time. And the violet oil beetle, you can occasionally find them on the coast and in all sorts of habitats, because as these are kleptoparasites on bees, they can be carried by bees all over the place, so they can turn up anywhere. As a rule, in South Devon, the violet oil beetles tend to live on Dartmoor in more upland areas, and particularly in woodlands and wooded valleys. This is in the Dart Valley on Dartmoor, which is one of the prime spots of them. There are a few sites around inland, or this is near Fingal Bridge on Dartmoor, and you can find black and violet oil beetles at this particular site. So you do occasionally get sites which support both, but usually you get a predominance of one species or the other. Though as a rule in Devon, if you're on the coast, it's going to be a black oil beetle. If you're inland on Dartmoor, it will be a violet oil beetle, but it's always worth checking everything. This third species, which again, now we're into the much rarer beetles. So the black and the violet oil beetle are reasonably widespread. All the others are scarce or very rare. And this one's a very rare species, the short-necked oil beetle. It has a different thorax shape. So whereas on the violet and the black oil beetles, the thorax is pretty well square-shaped, on the rarer species, the thorax is transverse, so it's much wider than it is long, so it's a rectangular shape, and that's a good feature. Also, it has straight antennae, so all the rare ones have straight antennae. I'll talk a little bit more about the violet and black oil beetles antennae a bit later, but their antennae always have a kink in them, and this is always a little bit smaller as well, so it's only 1 to 2 centimeters long, so it's noticeably smaller than the other species, the commoner species anyway. Now this species, the short-necked oil beetle, was thought to be extinct in the UK until I started this project, really, looking for oil beetles. I've been interested in oil beetles and put out, done talks on them and mentioned to people, if you find anything unusual, do get in touch with me. And because I'm sure the short-necked oil beetle is still around. And Bob Peckford, eminent microlepidopterist, was out in 2006 on the 1st of April, and he picked up a likely looking candidate for a short-necked oil beetle, and sure enough it was one at Bulbury Down. So that was the first record for about 50 or 60 years. So it just shows that these things can be overlooked. And it went on that we found actually quite a reasonable population on the coast just there. And it has now been found. So you can see the old distribution in the pale green, and currently we found it at Bulbury Down, so that was the first site for about 60 years, and since then it's been found in Wiltshire and in Pembrokeshire and Cahors in Southeast Ireland. That was from literally from a single triangulin larva, which was found on a bee by a friend of mine, Mark Telfer. So that's the only record from Ireland is one triangulin on one bee. And then Bob actually had a bit of a monopoly on the Milo brevicollis for a few years because he went up to Col looking for micro moths up there, and he found population of the oil beetle there. And that was again, the first records for Scotland. And since then, it's been found to be quite widespread. So in recent years, it's been found on Uist, Barra, as well, and Isla, as well as Col. And it probably occurs in other sites around northwest Scotland. And there it's associated with the same bee that Mark Telfer found it on in Cahors, which is a thing called Colitis floralis, a relative of the ivy bee. So this is the site at Bulbury Down, lovely flower-rich grassland along the coast there. And this is one of the main site, well, the only site really in Devon. It used to be known from Dartmoor, and it still may occur on Dartmoor. I've never managed to find it. But in Devon, currently the short-necked oil beetle is only known from here. It's active in the spring, and a couple of years ago in the summer there was an extensive fire for a few months actually, which burnt a lot of the cliffs quite dramatically. And it's since recovered, but luckily the area where the oil beetles are is at the top of the cliff, and that largely escaped the burn. So it has recovered quite well. And actually, there was a lot of scrub building up on the steeper parts of the cliff because there's no access for grazing animals. So this may, on the long term, have actually provided a lot more habitat for bees and hence oil beetles as well, although it's actually a very difficult bit of ground to actually access and survey. So this is a little bit further along at Bulbury, so showing typical bee nesting habitats where you can find the black oil beetle and the short-necked oil beetle. And the bees nest in these edges of these rutted paths, and these are the places to go and look. I usually go about middle of February, about Valentine's Day, is that when you get a sunny day around that time of year, you'll get the first black oil beetles emerging. And the short-necked oil beetles are usually a little bit later, so they're into the end of March and early April is the peak time to find those, first of all. And then both species will carry on right through May and into June sometimes. This is Cahors, where Mark found the triangulin on the Colitis floralis bee. So that's again quite a different habitat to the one in Devon, and also sites I know about on Dartmoor as well. So it's more about the bees that these things are using, about where they actually occur, the actual oil beetles. But there's not a huge amount known about the actual ecology and the actual species of bee which are used as host. You can find out a general information about them, but it's very hard to prove. So with the Colitis floralis, it is actually known as a host because this bee nests in sand dunes, and it's easy to access the nest. So you can actually dig out nests and find short-necked oil beetle larvae and pupae inside the Colitis floralis nest, so you can prove a link. Whereas at Bulbury Down, the bees are nesting in the ground. You can't go digging out the whole of it, trying to find bee nests and proving that the oil beetles come from that particular species. What I did was to do that, I went to the site in the spring because around the middle of February, any oil beetles which are emerging then will have just come out of the burrows of the host bee, whatever that is. And so what I do is make a note of those spots. Then I went back in towards the end of May, early June, when the triangulin larvae of the black oil beetle are emerging. And then when they're around, I just had a look sat down at that site and saw what bees are nesting in that particular spot. And it seemed to turn out to be mainly grey mining bees, Andrena cineraria. So that's almost certainly a host of the black oil beetle at Bulbury. But proving that is almost impossible because you've got to find the nest, which is hard enough, then dig out the nest and then find an oil beetle larva inside and prove that that's a black oil beetle. It's all very destructive. So that's the nearest I could get really during the course of the project. Then another one of the rarer species, this is the rugged oil beetle, and this has a completely different life history. So this is winter active, Again, it was thought to be extremely rare, sort of red data book species when I started working on this project, but it isn't actually as rare as it was once thought. And the reason it was thought it was considered rare is people didn't really know much about its ecology. So I remember finding one in Dorset years ago during the daytime, searching for it, but I didn't know at that time that it was a nocturnal species. It's also winter active, so it really appears when most entomologists are packing up their nets and collecting gear for the year. It appears in late September or October, and then it disappears by early April, and it's active at night. So that's why it eluded um, people for a long time. There were a few sites around Stroud and in Somerset, but it was thought to be, a Red Data Book 3 rarity. But during the course of the work I did for Bug Life, we found out that it was nocturnal. It was in that German oil beetle book. And so we went out at night to sites where one or two had been seen and found dozens of them. So it's actually a reasonably widespread species in calcareous sites. So on the Mendips and on the calcareous grasslands around Stroud, also in South Wales, and also on calcareous clays in Dorset. It almost certainly occurs on Portland. I always think I occasionally go bird watching on Portland Bill, and it must be there because there's old records of it from there, but I've never been out there at night to look for it. So if anyone tuning in tonight who lives near there, it'd be worth going out with a torch because I'm sure you'll find it there. And then it's been found in around Brighton, but the main populations are on these in the Chilterns around between really Stroud and then towards Oxford, where it's been found. And this is a site. This is Swift's Hill near Stroud, and steep south-facing bank, so it's never been ploughed. Really beautiful, stunning, species-rich grassland, swarming with bees in the summer. And you go there at this time of year, and you'll find dozens of rugged oil beetles there. You look at night. Another site. This is Burton Freshwater near Bridport, and here we have slightly calcareous clays, and you find small numbers, not so large, not such large numbers as at in near Stroud on the grasslands there, but you find reasonable numbers of them at sites like this. As I said, they're nocturnal, so you've got to go out with a torch at night, and it's not as hard as it might sound. Really, going out to look for a black beetle in the dark might sound like a tricky thing to do, but they're really quite easy to see in torchlight. They're active around areas so if you look for banks, south-facing banks, areas like by paths where you know that solitary bees are nesting, these are the sort of places to have a look at night with a torch, and they emerge as soon as it gets dark. So they about 5 o'clock at this time of year, you can start looking for these beetles, and they are surprisingly easy to spot. And this is us out a few years ago, looking at night, and you can photograph them. Quite often, actually, mobile iPhones and similar are very good for taking photographs at night under torchlight. Now, the rugged oil beetle is similar to another species, which I mistook it for several years. I think of the Mediterranean oil beetle. But the rugged oil beetle it's quite a small beetle. It's about 1.5 centimeters long. It's quite rugged and rugose, but it's also slightly shiny compared to its other confusion species. And the diagnostic feature again on the thorax is this very fine but distinct furrow down the middle of the thorax. Now, the closely related and very similar species is the one. If you're coming out on Friday evening, this is the one we're going to look for, the Mediterranean oil beetle. Now, this has an interesting history because when that British Wildlife publication was published, the article in British Wildlife was published, this was mentioned, but it had only just been discovered by an Italian coleopterist who had visited the Natural History Museum in London. And he looked through the collections, and he was looking through all the oil beetles. And in the series of rugged oil beetles, which are in the collection, he found some Mediterranean oil beetles from Kent and Essex. But none had been seen in recent years, and it was thought to be a long extinct resident. But actually, I'd already found it, and but I'd overlooked it because it is incredibly similar to the rugged oil beetle. So it was actually quite a strange coincidence because Bob Heckford in 2006 found that short-necked oil beetle, rediscovered it, hadn't been seen for 60 years. Um, I said, "Oh, I'd love to go down and see it." So he sent me the grid reference for where to go, where he found it. But he got one of the figures wrong in it. So I ended up about quarter of a mile, half a mile down the coast. I went down there, and the first thing I found was a dead specimen of this thing, which I thought was a rugged oil beetle, but actually it was a Mediterranean oil beetle. So within a week, and two long extinct oil beetles have been found in exactly the same site. So quite amazing, really. Um, Now, I thought this thing was a rugged oil beetle for a long time because it is so similar. But things about it were confusing because at Bulbury Down, it was the only site which isn't a calcareous grassland. Also, I even took this one up to Swift's Hill in Stroud just to stick it next to these other ones because it's all the ones at Bulbury Down were huge compared to the rugged oil beetles I found at other sites. And this is a feature of the Mediterranean oil beetle. It can get much bigger. It can be, 2 to 3 centimeters long, as big as some of the other the commoner ones, the violet and the black oil beetle. So, but it is, as you can see, it is strikingly similar. It has the straight antennae, it has the transverse thorax, and looks indeed, and it has the same habits as well. So it emerges at the end of September, and it will be active until about early April, and it is nocturnal. So the way I actually found it in the end was because I was doing this project. I was looking at the triangulin larvae at the various sites, and so I collected some triangulins from Bulbury Down and also from Burton Freshwater in Dorset, and the triangulins were completely different looking, and I thought, well, this there must be different species involved here. And so I dug out a key to the European species of oil beetle, the triangulins of those, and I keyed it out. And sure enough, the ones at Bulbury Down were Meloe mediterraneus, the Mediterranean oil beetle. So I found it about 5 or 6 years before. And it was only at that moment which I realized what I'd found. And it's very subtly different. So it doesn't have the very neat furrow down the middle of the thorax. It has a sort of indented area, but it's not so distinct. The triangulins, as you can see, are quite different looking. So that is the key feature. But also it doesn't, so far it's never been found in the same sites as rugged oil beetles. Rugged oil beetles have always been on calcareous sites. The Mediterranean oil beetle has only been found so far pretty well on the coast, and it also been found and misidentified in East Sussex. So once I'd published the information in the Coleopterus magazine, further records from which was slightly earlier, a couple of years earlier, came to light from Sussex. So that was its known distribution. So the old records were from Kent and Essex from about 100 years ago, so it may well still occur there. Then East Sussex, Bulbury Down, and since in a couple of years ago, we did quite an extensive survey working with Hayley Herridge, who used to work for BugLife, and friend Dave Turrell, and we went around quite a few sites between Start Point and Prawle and found, and most of them we found Mediterranean oil beetles. I think it was last year, one was found on the East Devon Pebblebed Heaths as well. So that's the only inland record so far. I did go back there at night a few times, but I could never find the beetles again. But it's, might take a little bit more effort to actually go out and find it there. There are old records of what are called rugged oil beetles from Exmouth, and I do wonder if they were actually Mediterranean oil beetles, and maybe it does occur on the coast around Exmouth as well, and maybe that's mainly where it occurs, and you get the odd stragglers inland on the heaths. But that's again another thing to work on, going out and looking at night this time of year on the coast. So night searching, as I said, this is the way to find this beetle. So this is where we're going out on Friday night at to Great Matterscombe at Start Point. And this was a few years ago when Haley took this photograph of me with a big torch, go out with a torch and look on all the areas, all these sort of south-facing slopes where you get the solitary bees are nesting, and then look in those at this time of year, and you'll certainly find plenty of Mediterranean oil beetles. They're reasonably common where they occur, because obviously these sites are really good for bees, and they have really good big populations of bees, and the oil beetles do well on those. So as I said, this is that one's let's see, is that a rugged? No, see, they're pretty similar looking from the side. I wouldn't be able to know. I think that's probably a Mediterranean oil beetle. But they use these solitary bees. So this is a typical spring flying Andrena hemorrhoa, the orange-tailed mining bee. And so this is a typical host probably for violet oil beetles on Dartmoor. Certainly there's an association with populations of this bee and where I see the violet oil beetles. And so when you're looking for these bees and the beetles, they're active in the spring. So the bees and the beetles, and they like flower-rich sites. So this is a site near me where I studied the violet oil beetles, and it's, as you can see, it's full of dandelions, and then there's lots of other flowers that follow on from that. So during the spring, there's a succession of nectar sources for the solitary bees. So there's really big populations of bees there and really large populations of violet oil beetles. So when oil beetles first emerge from the bee nest, and this is a short-necked oil beetle, they haven't got the big fat bodies that, typical. If you've seen these beetles, one thing you really notice about them is the really extended abdomen. So when they first emerge, it's just the bare essentials of the beetle, which is formed from the pollen source which it's used underground in the bee nest. So the body, the actual abdomen, doesn't actually extend beyond the tips of the wing cases at this stage. So if you find one like this, you know that it's only just emerged from the bee nest. And so you're very close to where the host bee is nesting. But they feed up very quickly, and they like to feed on all sorts of plants, but they do have preferences. So this is a violet oil beetle, and they do like celandines and cuckoo pint, and they will often eat the flowers of celandines and also buttercups, but they'll also eat grasses, and sometimes they occur in places where there aren't many flowers and they'll just feed on grass. So they feed on whatever they can find, really. I did some feeding experiments on the rugged oil beetle, this is a pair of rugged oil beetles, and I kept them in a pot at night with various food plants from around where I found the adult beetles. And you can see they really like the dandelion, particularly like the celandine flower there. And the buttercup was by far their favourite. So they always eat all of the buttercup first. But often on the sites, there weren't any buttercups. So when we found them out at night, they were often feeding on grasses. And another one, this is with Mallory mediterraneus. So that one, again, it ate all the buttercup, and that was its favourite. So when I keep these in captivity, and when I've done experiments, rearing them, I always feed them on buttercup leaves. Creeping buttercup, they absolutely love. So this is the same beetle. So this is a violet oil beetle just emerged from its nest, and that's the same beetle 24 hours later. So they can feed up very quickly. If there's available food plants around, they'll just munch away, and you get this big extended body. You can tell all the British Malloes apart, the sexes apart, by looking at the underside of the last segment on the abdomen. And in a male, it has a little kink in it, a little indentation. And on the female, it's just completely rounded at the end. And that's a useful feature for sexing any of the British Malloes. The violet and the black oil beetle, as I mentioned earlier, have kinked antennae. So you can see there's a male violet oil beetle, and you see he's got a very distinct kink in his antennae. Only the black and the violet oil beetle have that. All the other rarer oil beetles have straight antennae. And this one, he's probably homing in on a pheromone scent maybe produced by a female, because you often find male oil beetles doing this, climbing up into the vegetation and swiveling their heads around, maybe trying to pick up a scent of a female. And here's some black oil beetles. So when the male finds a female, he will follow her, and then he will jump on the back, and then they do a little bit of courtship, which is the male has much more kinked antennae than the female, and he will draw the female's antennae through the kink in his antennae, and like in this process. And this is not entirely sure what's happening here, whether it's a tactile thing or it's a pheromone scent has been passed on, but it is essential that this happens before mating will take place. And then this is prior to mating, and then once they're mating, the male will be dragged around by the female. So this is a pair of violet oil beetles, and they mate for about an hour. So wherever the female goes, the male gets dragged along. And if you look on the celandine flower, that the just by the female there, you can see some little black triangling larvae, and they are the triangling larvae of the previous generation of violet oil beetles. Now, the females will, I think they only mate once. I mean, sometimes they may mate more times, but they generally, from what I've observed, they mate once. But the males, of course, will pester them. If they find a female, they will try and mate with her throughout the season. But in this case, the female will always stick her antennae right flat to the ground, so the male can't grip them with the kinks in his antenna, and that's one way of dissuading him. And the other method she has is, because he's mounted on her back, she just crawls through some vegetation and ejects him that way and gets rid of the unwanted male that way. Other species, so this is rugged oil beetles mating. They don't have the kinked antenna, so they don't have that behavior. There's a little bit of courtship with a male moving his palps over the female before they mate, but not so elaborate as the violet and black. And that's the Mediterranean oil beetles. And again, it's very similar to the rugged oil beetle mating. Now, after mating, the females will spend a lot of time sunbathing and feeding, and their bodies will get absolutely enormous. They can lay up to 40,000 eggs, and they need to do this because their life history is so risky. And so you often find females like this that are almost like fit to burst. This is a female violet oil beetle in late April, and she's ready to lay her eggs now. So when she lays her eggs, she'll dig a burrow in the ground. This is a black oil beetle, digging a burrow around, and then she'll reverse into it and then lay a batch of eggs inside of a few thousand eggs. And she can dig several of these burrows during her lifetime. And then the eggs are underground. So this is some violet oil beetle eggs, but all the eggs of all the different species look similar. And so in the case of the violet oil beetle, they will overwinter. But in case of the black oil beetle, they will emerge a few weeks later. Now, the triangling larvae are actually, in a way, easier to identify than the adult beetles, because they're all quite different, but they are tiny. They're absolutely tiny. The biggest one is about 2.5 millimeters long, so that's the black ones on the left, which are violet oil beetles. Then at about sort of 1.5 to 2 millimeters long are the orange larvae of the violet oil beetle on the left, the black ones. Then the orange larvae are the black oil beetle. Yeah, the violet oil beetle are black. The black oil beetles are orange. And then the other species, the rarer species, have tiny triangling larvae. They're only about 1 millimeter long, sometimes slightly less. So you can see the next picture along to the right, there's a rugged oil beetle larva at the top and a Mediterranean larva below that. And to the right are the brown, tiny, tiny brown larvae of the short-necked oil beetle. So they're all actually quite easy to identify. And that's a little guide which I've got. This is on my website, if you want to have a look at that. Generally, violet oil beetle larvae are black, but you do sometimes get yellow form of it. I've very rarely seen that, but it does occur. And they're also the most conspicuous because they are black and they swarm on flowers, and they have quite long tails, and they're about 2 to 2.5 millimeters long. Then you got the black oil beetle larva, which is about 1.5 millimeters long, and again that's quite reasonably conspicuous on the flowers. whereas the other three species are tiny, and you've really got to disturb the flower a little bit often to see them at all, unless they're in quite large numbers, like you can see the short-necked orb beetle larvae on the right there. And there's an example. So there's some violet orb beetle larvae, the black ones, and the tiny little orange dots on the left-hand side are Mediterranean orb beetle larvae. So the life history is quite strange. The reason the females lay so many eggs is because they have this risky life history. So when these are larvae of violet oil beetles, they emerge in the spring and they'll climb up into vegetation. They'll sit on flowers and they'll wait there until any insect visits that flower. So they're all sitting there waiting for an insect to come along to the flower. And when it does, they'll jump on board. And they use this as a method to get around the countryside. So the oil beetles obviously can't fly, but the triangulins can fly on bees. So they can also use this method to disperse. So they'll go on any insects. But sometimes well, the ones that survive are those tiny few which get onto certain species of solitary bee, get taken onto a female bee, get taken into the burrow and then jump off and then feed on the pollen supply that the bee has collected for her own larva. So yeah, the chances are very slim because the bees will also try and get them off. If they find triangulins on their body, the female bees will try and get rid of them. So it's a very risky life history, but it does work in a small number of times for each egg batch because you always get some oil beetles appearing each year. These are black oil beetle larvae, and they often form these clumps. And it's not known exactly why they do this, but it does attract small bees. It's a little bit of video of this. They're very active, these larvae. They're constantly on the wait for bees coming by. And this is a little halictid bee, a little furrow bee. And you can see it's gone near those triangulins and they've covered its thorax. It can hardly fly. But when it does fly off, or if it's a female, which that was the case, if it goes back to the burrow, those oil beetle larvae will be into the burrow immediately. And the black oil beetles were very common at that particular site. There they are. That's on some thrift at Bulbury Down in May, end of May, early June. And you can see the triangulin larvae of the black oil beetle quite distinctly there. But often there's just one or two on the flowers, so they can be quite tricky to see, and it's particularly the tiny ones. That's a little Mediterranean oil beetle larva. And as you can see, there's a rugged oil beetle larva, just to show how tiny they are. So I found, by going to the sites where we found the rugged and black oil beetles and all the species of oil beetle, actually by going at the appropriate time to find the larvae, you can look on flowers and you almost where you've seen the adult beetles and you will find the triangulin larvae. And one technique I have is to use a magnifying glass and just grab, so this is on Bulbury Down, just grabbing clumps of thrift, and just that little bit of disturbance agitates the larvae and they think something's come to visit the flower and they all come running out because they can be hidden away quite deep inside the flower sometimes. And this is a nomad bee, so it's a type of cuckoo bee. And this one has some violet oil beetle triangulins clinging onto the side of it. So this is another method that they could get into a host bee's nest, because the cuckoo bee here will, if it's a female, will go in and try and lay eggs in a mining bee's nest. And so this could be the point where the oil beetle larva jumps off and finds a source of food. So it's another method it could get on into a nest. This is actually a six-banded nomad bee, maybe extinct in the UK now, but this was at Prawl. It's one of the last ones I saw, and this was covered in black oil beetle triangulins. You see on the back of the thorax there. Hasn't got any orange on its body, this bee, but in this case it looks like it's got an orange rear end to the thorax, and that's all black oil beetle triangulins. But that, as I said, they do go onto any insect. So this is one on an orange tip butterfly, and they even go onto oil beetles as well. So you find when oil beetles are visiting flowers, they'll get oil beetle triangulins on them. In the case of the violet oil beetle, when you get the triangulin larvae and the adults at the same time. Now, the triangulins are called triungulins. Sometimes people say, well, I used to mistakenly call them triangulins because you just might think that's the name. But ungulin it comes from uncus, meaning hook, and they have 3 hooks on each foot. And this is to enable them to grip onto their hosts. And there's some rugged oil beetle larvae. So this is at Swift's Hill at Stroud. And there were lots of larvae on the flowers, and there were lots of little Halictus tumulurum bees, these little furrow bees there, which are almost certainly the host. Again, it's pretty impossible to try and prove that, but by deduction, really, there were lots of these bees around where the oil beetles occur. And there's another one. So there's a violet oil beetle larva sat on the back of a orange-tailed mining bee. Now, as I said, to prove this is pretty tricky, you've got to find the bee nest, which sometimes is quite hard. Sometimes you can find the spoil heaps from a mining bee nest. This is an Andrena mining bee nest. And that's what the oil beetle larva is after. So that's the food supply and the egg. That this is a Laziglossum calceatum common furrow bee nest, which I dug out and found like an orange, but it's actually a ball of pollen and an egg of the bee on that. So that's what the oil beetle larva is trying to get into a nest and find this. Then it will presumably destroy the host's egg or larva and then eat all its food. And judging by the size of some of these oil beetles, they probably move through the soil and actually find several nests to feed on. Other insects do this as well. So bee flies are parasites in the nests of solitary bees. They have a slightly different tactic. The female bee flies will lay their eggs near solitary bee nests. And the larva of the bee flies, again, is a tiny little active larvae called a planidium. And that will crawl into a bee nest. When it finds a bee larva, it will sit beside it and then wait for the bee larva to become full grown and then suck all its insides out. And then rather than a bee emerging from that nest, a bee fly will emerge. And bee flies are very common. And so each one of those bee flies you see in the spring has taken out a nest of some kind of solitary bee. Then on the right is a nomad bee, which is a cuckoo bee in Andrena nests. So there's various species of those. And also earwigs will go into nests as well and raid the pollen. So these solitary bees really do have to work hard to keep one step ahead of these parasites, which are cashing in on their hard work. And as well as those, there's flies. These are Leucophora flies, and these are like little heat-seeking missiles that follow bees back to their burrow. And then when the bee's gone in there, the Leucophora fly will wait beside the burrow. The bee goes in, unloads some pollen, comes out, and then the Leucophora fly will go in there and lay some eggs, or eggs which very quickly hatch into little maggots and then feed on the contents of the nest. As I said, it sounds a fairly simple process of a bee happens to go to a flower with triangulins on, and then they jump onto the bee, and then they get taken back to the nest and jump off and turn into an oil beetle. But it's not that simple. I did this experiment with an Andrena nitida, a grey patch mining bee, and this one I caught some triangulin larvae. I found a female which was heading back to her burrow, and I put her in a tube for a little while with some triangulins, and they jumped on her body. And then I let her go and just watched her burrow just to see if she would return. But she didn't return immediately. She spent several minutes buzzing around in the undergrowth and dislodged all of the triangulins and then went back to her burrow. So it's quite a tricky thing to get on into a nest of any solitary bee. And I think the few that do maybe get onto bees right at the end of the season when they're a bit tired and worn, and they've built most of their nests and provision those, and maybe they're a bit tired, and then they don't remove the triangulin larvae, and a few of the triangulin larvae get into the bee nest. It's probably something like that. But the bees certainly know that they're bad news and get them off. That was the one that I did that experiment on. And I did a little mark recapture work on the oil beetles just to see how many were present at certain sites. Now, I've done this on other species before. This is a Kugelland's ground beetle. And with ground beetles, I could scratch a little mark or a number on the back of the beetle with a scalpel, and then I could know that individual beetle or know exactly when it was marked. And I found these beetles actually live for about 3 years sometimes. But with oil beetles, they got a very soft cuticle, and it was impossible to mark them in that way. Also, the cuticle, I tried painting them with bits of coloured paint and Tipp-Ex and things like that. But I kept them, I marked some and kept them in a tub at home. And then within a few days, all the markings had come off. So that was useless as well. So the only method I could actually work out how to mark in, well, not individuals, but ones that I'd seen before, was to get a pair of scissors and just snip off the very end of one of the wing cases, which doesn't harm the beetle. They live perfectly well after that. But it means that I can identify that I've marked that beetle before, and so I know it's been seen before, and then I can estimate the number in the population. So that's a female violet oil beetle in my study area. What I found is when I went to a site, this is at Brook Manor, near where I live in Buttersley. When I go to this site in the spring, I'd often see like 10, 15 oil beetles at a time, and you may think that that's how many there are. But when you mark them, I found there are over 100 individuals there. And they're actually, most of the time, they were quite cryptic and quite difficult to find. I mean, to start with, I used to go out on sunny days because that's when I assumed all the beetles were mainly active in the sunshine in the spring. But a bit later, I found that actually the best time to find them is when it was a bit drizzly and damp, because the oil beetles would come out and sun themselves. And when it's very warm and sunny, they then tend to dive down into the vegetation and disappear. But when it was a bit cloudy and dull, they'd stay out longer and sunbathe, and it was actually easier to find them. But this was the distribution of the violet oil beetles in that meadow. And that ties in very closely with where I found the bees, the solitary bees nesting, which were much, much more difficult to find than the oil beetles. There are also lots and lots of bee flies there, lots of nomad bees, and also earwigs and leucophora flies as well. So this is a really good area for nesting bees, but also a very good area for the parasitoids. And those parasitoids, the bee flies and oil beetles, are really good indicators of where you find solitary bees, because everything's after these bees. So it's not surprising that they're quite hard to see. You know, they nip in and out of their nests really quickly. They're very busy collecting food or looking for mates the rest of the time, and they're really quite hard to observe. I did try and prove some of the hosts, and by deduction, I knew that there were orange-tailed mining bees here, and also Andrena scotica, the chocolate mining bee, was quite common in this meadow where there were lots of oil beetles. So they're almost certainly the hosts. But I did try digging some nests out. So these are marked nests of solitary bees in that meadow. And what I do to dig one out is put a bit of long piece of grass down the burrow, because it's once you start digging out, it's very difficult to tell where that burrow is. And then I'd follow the grass down and dig it out. And this was an Andrena nitida nest, and I got down to about 30 centimeters and then found a pollen ball with an egg. And I did this to a few nests, but it is so destructive. And I never found one with an oil beetle larva on it in the nest, even though there were hundreds of oil beetles, 100 or so oil beetles in that area, and thousands of triangulums. So that's what they use and that's what they're after. But trying to prove the host is extremely difficult. It is possible to rear them, and Anne Halpin, who used to work for Bug Life, was reasonably successful with this, or certainly getting the oil beetle triangle into its next stage. So it starts off as a little black larva. This is a violet oil beetle larva, but it gets into a bee nest, and then it turns into a sort of white grub, which then feeds up. So once it's in the nest, it molts and turns into a sort of grub like this, which feeds on the pollen supply. That's a photo that Anne sent me. It's very difficult to get the humidity right to get this. I mean, Anne got this one to this stage, but then it died from mold a bit later on. I tried a few times, but this occurs in the spring and I'm busy and out all the time. You'd really need to get a lab situation set up where you could have control the conditions and try and rear some of these things, because it would be really interesting to not only to see this stage of the life, but also see what happens in the nest when you get competition between nomad bee larvae, bee fly larvae, when they're all in the same nest. What happens then? Who wins out in those situations? It would be really interesting to study, but a bit beyond what I do. So there's still a lot of things to learn about these beetles. So, I've been studying them for 20, 30 years now, but they're still fascinating, and there's still lots to discover about them. There's further information available on my website. If you look on my website, johnwalters.co.uk, under research, there's a page all about oil beetles. Stephen Falk, some of you may know, has a very good website on all sorts of things, and he's got a section on oil beetles with photographs and identification tips. And that's on Stephen. If you search for Stephen Falk Flickr, you'll find all his various Flickr collections of bees and oil beetles and flies. It's a very, very useful resource for anyone interested in insects. Bug Life have a page on their website devoted to the oil beetle hunt, and there you can find the oil beetle identification guide and more information on oil beetles. And there's also an oil beetle recording scheme, which if you look under coleoptera.org.uk, you'll find that, more information on that. iRecord is the place to add your records. So if you can submit records to iRecord, they'll be verified probably by Liam Olds, who works for Bug Life, and he's an oil beetle expert in South Wales, and he will review the records that are submitted to iRecord. And there is a Twitter site for anyone left on Twitter. I mean, I think most people have left now who are naturalists. I've left recently. I don't want anything to do with Musk or Trump. So after 12 years, I just destroyed my account. But I'm now on Blue Sky and Instagram, so I'll go there. I don't know if Oil Beetles UK is still on Twitter because I'm not on there, but it may well still be on there. So as I said, lots still to learn. I'll just finish off showing you a species which may occur in South Devon. This is the Stenoria, the ivy bee oil blister beetle or oil beetle. And this is associated with ivy bees, which have colonized Devon in the last 20 years. The ivy bee was discovered new to science in Italy in about early 1990s. Since then, it's spread rapidly across Europe, and it's crossed the Channel about 20 years ago first of all into Dorset and then into Devon, and now it's got right up into Scotland. What it's done is it's escaped its parasitoid. So there's a nomad bee which goes after it, and this oil beetle which goes after it as well. So you can as it's escaped its parasitoids, it's able to build up huge populations, which are used to being having some sort of parasitoid predation. When that's removed, the ivy bee population rockets. So this is Stenoria analis, the ivy bee blister beetle. It may be in the UK already, but no one's ever seen it. But it does occur on Jersey. So I went there in September. And if you're looking for this species, it's probably easiest to find the eggs, which are laid on dead grasses near ivy bee colonies. The beetles are active in August, and the ivy bees generally emerge in September. So the beetles are active a little bit before the bees are active. And this is just on the southwest of Jersey. This is September. I went there specially because this has an amazing life history, which I've always wanted to see. And that's the oil beak. So these can fly. Now that's a fully laden female with eggs, so she was pretty useless at flying at this stage, but they can fly. The triangle in larvae of this species forms a clump, and it's thought that it might produce a pheromone scent which attracts male bees. And eventually one came in and tried to mate with that clump of triangulins, gets covered in triangulins, and then these jump off the male onto the female ivy bee when they're mating, and then get taken back to the nest that way. So an amazing life history. And again, if you look closely at that bit of video, if you watch it on repeat, you'll see the female ivy bee is flicking off one of the Stenoria oil beetle triangulins from her body. So it's even tricky once it's got off. So it's got to get onto a male to start with, then onto a female, then avoid detection, then get taken to the nest, and then turn into a oil beetle. So that's the end of the talk. If you like any more information, have a look at my website, johnwalters.co.uk, and there's all sorts of information on there about talks and things I do, but also look under the research for oil beetles in particular. And hopefully I'll see some of you on Friday when we go out looking for Mediterranean oil beetles at Start Point. Thank you very much.
Perfect. Thank you very much, John. It's a very, very interesting talk. And now we'll sort of open the floor and see if anybody's got any questions. I see there's one question from David in the chat. Says, having seen one at Stella Tracy's the following year, I seem to see them everywhere, having never noticed them before. My records went to DBRC. Do you see those for checking identification?
I don't see those personally. I don't know if they get checked. I don't think they get checked by DBRC actually. The best way to get them, I mean, I'm sure if you found them at Stella's, there'll be violet oil beetles there, which I'm sure you've identified them as that. But the best way to actually get them onto the system is put them onto iRecord, and then they will get verified. Or send them to Martin Luff, of the Devonshire Association, who is the county recorder for Devon. You can find the information online where to submit that, because then it will get verified. Otherwise, records just sent to DBRC are put onto the system but not verified, as far as I know.
Yeah, when we go out on Friday, I would encourage everyone to try and record sightings using iRecord, because we're able to draw down that information for the Life on the Edge project, and it can help us inform us on where habitat creation is the most useful for the oil beetles. So we also will be able to give out an information sheet on Friday, which shows where there have already been sightings of the black oil beetle, the Mediterranean oil beetle, and the short-necked oil beetle. And it shows areas where where potentially surveying for oil beetles would be very useful. So if you're not able to attend on Friday, please feel free to drop a message to the Life on the Edge email, and I will be able to send a copy of that over to you if you're interested. Are there any other questions? It seems like perhaps that's a no, in which case, thank you everybody for attending, and thank you very much, John. And hopefully we will see some of you on Friday.
Yeah, 7 o'clock at the car park at Start Point.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's not too far to walk. So if you're coming along, I'm sure Sam has said, bring some decent boots, any sort of outdoor kit, and a torch if you have one. And if you've got a camera or your phone, that'd be useful. We can take some photos of the oil beetles. I'm sure we'll find some.
Perfect. All right. Thank you very much, and have a great night, everybody.
Okay. Thanks, Sam.
Thanks, John.
Okay.
Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye.